Welcome to Clarity in a Messy World, the podcast that looks at the causes behind the most confounding issues of our time. I'm David Wayne Callahan. In every episode, I'll be speaking with experts who will share their knowledge and insights and help us to untangle a seemingly chaotic world. Clarity in a Messy World is a production of Bocconi University Milan in collaboration with the Bocconi Student Media Center. In today's world, barriers seem to be a thing of the past. We're accustomed to goods, investments, and to some extent, people moving freely across the globe. This wasn't the case 20 years ago, when the word globalization ignited public discourse. Since then, globalization has brought about some deep changes in the way we live and interact with each other. We now inhabit a global world. But is it permanent? Or is the pendulum of history about to swing back? Joining us today is Professor Gianmarco Ottaviano. Gianmarco is Professor of Economics and holds the Achille and Giulia Boroli Chair in European Studies at Bocconi University. He taught previously at the London School of Economics and the University of Bologna. His research activity focuses on the competitiveness of firms in the global economy and the economic effects of immigration and offshoring on employment and wages. Gianmarco, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Gianmarco, not long ago, globalization seemed to be the next big thing, with its promises of access to new and inexpensive merchandise, the adventure of travel and professional experiences abroad, and general worldwide exchange. But currently, protectionism, isolationism, and even populism seem to be on the rise as a reaction to globalization. When did all this start?
So we've seen a recent rise, as you said, in the reaction to globalization. But the first reactions, at least in our recent history, they date to the end of the last century. So essentially, at that time in the 90s, we had an acceleration of globalization, but we started to have some initial backlash, or at least visible backlash, with protests in the street. So the most famous one is probably the Seattle protest, called also N30, for November 13, 1999, and it was against the WTO, so against trade and trade liberalization. The year after, in Washington, we had A16. A16 was for April 16, and here the protest was against the IMF and the World Bank. The WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, they are the three pillars of the global order in terms of international institutions. And then there was, in 2001, an important moment in which China was admitted to the WTO. So it was admitted to trade with the other countries on equal grounds. And that was a defining moment because it gave rise to the penetration of Chinese imports in other countries. And then I would highlight 2008 and the financial crisis and the austerity that followed as another important moment, defining moment of this backlash against globalization.
And has this backlash followed the same pattern all across the world, or do local characteristics predominate?
So the recent backlash is seen, and it is mostly a phenomenon involving Western democracies. But the backlash that we were talking about just now, that of the 90s, was indeed starting from the point of view of developing countries. So it started as a backlash against what was called at that time the Washington Consensus. And this consensus was essentially a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions that were considered to constitute the standard reform package to be promoted across the world, especially for developing countries, by the IMF and the WTO, and also strong support from the US Department of Treasury. It was an approach that was strongly market-based and its critics, they started to call it neo-liberalism.
The city of Scranton, Pennsylvania, famous over a century ago for its production of Nottingham lace, is now popularly known as the birthplace of American President Joseph Biden, who often references the city when he wants to be folksy. In one of your papers, you have an instructive story about the city. Can you share that?
So the city of Scranton has been traditionally one of the manufacturing centers for the lace industry in the US, and was a rich city that could rely on this local industry for the well-being of the inhabitants, and also attracted a lot of immigration from the rest of the US. The story is quite interesting because it highlights what can be connected to one of these features of the Washington consensus. So we said these are a set of reforms, of policy reforms, and one of them was trade liberalization, so liberalization of trade with respect to the rest of the world. And this is what interferes some way with the rosy picture of Scranton, because when trade, especially with China, opened up, but also with a lot of other emerging countries, the local industry, that is the lace industry, started to collapse. And with that, a lot of things started to disappear. So let's keep in mind that the Scranton Lace Company essentially gave more than wage to thousands of men and women. This is a nice story told by Chris Hedges in a recent book. So it gave dignity, purpose, pride, a sense of place, hope, and self-esteem. And we don't have to forget, it also gave tax revenues for the local authorities to support the supply of public goods, from education and medicine to law and order. Now, where is this industry today? It's not in Scranton, unfortunately, anymore. It is somewhere else. It is in Mexico, it is in Turkey, it is in India, it is in Portugal and China. And this is not because the demand for lace in the US has disappeared completely, but it is because of what we are calling globalization. So the possibility of importing lace from countries that are more competitive under different points of view, in particular possibly in terms of lower wages.
Economic crises, immigration, and technological change are among the drivers of the globalization backlash. Is international trade the common denominator behind these phenomena?
So international trade is one of the aspects of the great change that has happened in the recent decades. So from historical perspective, historians, they tend to define two moments of globalization, what they call two waves. One wave was at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and ended with the two world wars, and the second wave came after the Second World War. There are strong analogies between these two waves, but also important differences. So international trade, anyway, was a pillar of the first globalization, wave of globalization. It's also a pillar of the second wave of globalization. But at the same time, other things are and were happening. So international trade is a component of this trajectory of the 21st century, much like it was the century before, during the first wave. But there are big differences that we should keep in mind. And these are related to first, the flow of information and ideas across the world that is much more pronounced nowadays than before. So maybe any kind of reaction is amplified by this flow of information. The level of education in several countries was much lower than it is today. So maybe people now they ask questions and look for answers that they didn't have in mind at that time. And also, since the recent backlash is, as we already discussed, is mostly involving Western democracies, we have to remember that our democracies in most countries at that time, so a century ago, didn't feature a universal suffrage. So the voters were only a selected group, and that group was the elite. So nowadays it's different. We have still selected groups, but the vote is much more universal than it used to be. And in some way, this is what is creating tension. And in some sense, it is an improvement with respect to the past.
So first, Gianmarco, what constitutes a winner and a loser?
So, I mean, from a production point of view, which is probably what workers have in mind, the distinction between a winner and a loser depends on the occupation and the sector in which you are occupied. So it is indeed the job that you are performing. So a loser is typically someone who's involved in a production process in a sector or in a specific occupation within the production process that is moved to another country. And is moved to another country maybe because the firm you're working for prefers to pay lower wages somewhere else, or simply because a competitor of your firm appears somewhere else. In that case, either you lose your job or you have to reduce your wage. And this is possibly the simplest definition of the loser. Winners are instead those that don't face this kind of challenge. They have their jobs secured, and therefore, even if your company is shifting production abroad, or if some competitor to your company appears abroad, then your specific occupation is not going to be under pressure. So globalization was not unavoidable and is not irreversible. I think this is also one of the things that we are learning nowadays, that it is a political choice. It's not like, in a sense, something that comes from nature and we have to take it as it is. It is a political choice. And as any political choice, it has consequences that are good for some and less good for others. In this sense, any policy change, any political reform is bound to generate winners and losers. Otherwise, it would not. Otherwise, it would arise autonomously without any specific political choice. So, if we all agree on something, then this is not going to take much time to realize. Here, possibly, there have been two issues that are worth highlighting. So, maybe people were not told or did not realize that this was a political choice that could be made and there were alternative choices. And the second, it may be they were told, but the package that was proposed and the promises that were made were broken later, meaning that the losers were what we call nowadays the losers, so they've been negatively affected by globalization, were expecting some kind of compensation, some kind of redistribution of the gains that eventually didn't happen.
What can be done to mitigate this disparity in the future?
So possibly one of the main features that a well-functioning market should exhibit is what in sports they call fair play. So we agree on a set of rules. These rules are explained to everybody. Everybody agrees on the rules. Possibly, given democracy, these rules are voted in explicitly. And so this fair play explain and vote explicitly on the rules of the game so that we can all agree on that. And then everybody should stick to the rules. So what is possibly the source of concern and maybe a source of the backlash is that people have the impression that there are no rules sometimes, or that the rules have been introduced by someone else, and maybe a third option, and which is not exclusive of the others, those who have introduced the rules, they are the first to violate them. And so probably in perspective, what should be considered with more attention is an effort to make the process more politically inclusive and less technically exclusive. So in a sense, I feel a friction between something, say, trade liberalization and all these trade agreements that sound very technical and are decided, at least there is a perception, they are decided in some technical sphere. And then the rest of us who see the results and we have the impression we have not been involved in the political process as much as it should have been.
In Western societies, social mobility is thought to be an effective antidote for inequality. Has globalization impacted social mobility in any way?
So this is a good question, which is really related to what we were saying before about fair play. So, I keep on using this metaphor of sports because it's very direct. So we may have rules that have the objective of letting excellence in sports emerge. And if you think about sports, of course, you're not happy if the team you're supporting is not winning, but if in the end your team has lost through a fair game, so through something that has given the same opportunities to both teams, then probably you're going to accept the result in a different way. So what I have in mind is, for example, this big debate on different generations of immigrants in, for example, in France, where you had immigration from Algeria when Algeria became independent. And so you had the first generation of people that became parents that were, I wouldn't say happy, but still willing to suffer all the difficulties of immigration and finding a job and bringing up a family. And they were willing to pay this cost themselves. With the perspective of seeing their kids, obtaining the benefits of their efforts. And so in France, you see this contrast between a first generation of immigrants, and I think probably also in other countries, that are not complaining about unfair outcomes. They feel that this is the cost they have to pay. But then they're willing to pay because they expect their kids to participate to the fair match, to the fair game.
Exactly.
And then when it gets to the second generation, you see that riots in the streets start to build up because the second generation is saying, okay, my parents were sacrificing for my future, and now my future is not there. Someone has stolen my future. And I think this is an important aspect. And we see in our studies that globalization has other phenomena, but globalization in particular has impacted the social mobility, reducing this perception that, okay, there is inequality now, but in the future there will still be maybe inequality, but I will have a fair chance to climb the social ladder.
At this point, can the losers in globalization hope for a better future for their children?
I think here the biggest challenge is, and as usual in history, I guess, is entrenched privilege. In the sense that the globalized economy and the speed at which things have been changing in the recent decades requires a skill upgrade of the younger generation, at least. It would require also of the older ones, but at least of the younger generations. But this skill upgrade requires skills that are increasingly costly to acquire, in the sense that only the happy few, the good part of the income distribution, can afford to bring these skills to their kids on their own means. So they don't need help from the government, for example. So to me, what is crucial is really investment in public provision of education and skill upgrade.
Gianmarco, in one of your recent studies, you concluded that the COVID-19 pandemic is at once globalization-driven and prompting, if only for a short time, deglobalization. What might this mean for our future?
I think there are, among others, there are two key trends that we should follow with a lot of attention. The first is the effect that the COVID pandemic is having in deleting all unnecessary contact. And this is, I would say, unnecessary between inverted commas, so quote unquote, because the definition of what is necessary and what is unnecessary is sometimes related also, again, once more, to income and privilege. So this is something that we should take into account. There will be a change in our way of living in terms of leisure, but also in terms of the way we work. And the risk here is, once more, the segregation of the happy few and the others in terms this time of enjoying the possibilities of a global economy.
Mm-hmm. And your research goes in depth into particular aspects of the backlash against globalization. And one of these is the disruption of global value chains. Can you explain that within the context of Brexit?
So we talked already about the two waves of globalization. And I briefly said that there are many things in common. And one of these things in common is trade liberalization. Now, the effect of trade liberalization is that you can separate economic activities. And some people have written about, for example, Richard Baldwin at the University of Geneva has written about two unbundlings. So the first unbundling is when you are able to import your the goods you need for final consumption from abroad, then you can specialize on a subset of goods in which you are better in producing, so you're more efficient in supplying. And then you can import everything else from abroad. This is the first unbundling. So it is unbundling between production and consumption. And it is the characteristics of the first wave of globalization. Now, the second wave of globalization has brought a second unbundling, which is not only between production and consumption, but within production, within the production process, the different stages can be separated. And so this is the idea of global value chains. These are chains of production, that is sequential stages of production in which goods are becoming close from inputs to final production. What you are working on is becoming closer and closer to the final product. And in this second unbundling, these different stages can be allocated to the countries that are most efficient in dealing with them. And this is something that requires a lot of integration. So just think about a smartphone or a car. I mean, all these different ingredients that you have in the final product, all these different components, they can be produced nowadays in different countries and then assembled somewhere. And in order to do that in an economically effective way, clearly you need to have almost free flow of trade in intermediate products. And that is the way in which, for example, the car industry has been organized within the European Union. So each country in the European Union is not as large as the US in terms of offering a domestic market in which you can enjoy the effects of scale economies in production. But the single market together can achieve sort of similar scale to the US market. And so the car industry in Europe is organized with all these different phases of the value chain taking place in different parts of the continent. With Brexit, an important part of this chain of production has now become separated. There are no barriers in terms of tariffs, so in terms of taxes at the border, but there are going to be, and there are already now, and even more in the future, there might be barriers in terms of checks that you have to perform at the border, the so-called rules of origin. And we are seeing now that there are going to be, and there are already big disruptions in terms of the value chains, for example, in the car industry. This is something that big companies will learn to deal with, but there are some small producers that are part of this ecosystem of sequential production. They might not be able to cope with that. And so this could be a challenge, and some way will highlight some of the benefits of globalization that are hidden from the eyes of the consumer.
Gianmarco, ever since the Luddites smashed machinery in British textile mills in the 1810s, there has been an enduring fear of technology diminishing employment. And It seems logical to me that factory workers would be wary of automation as they could lose their jobs to robots. But in a larger context, are these fears founded on fact?
So you're right. I mean, this is an important issue. So there is a direct effect of automation, say, of robots that everybody understands, which is what we may call a substitution effect. If a robot is able to perform my task, then they will use the robot and I will lose my job. And this is clearly, it's there and it is in the data too. At the same time, there is an indirect effect, which is we may call a productivity effect. By adopting robots, by automating, then firms become and the production process becomes more efficient, more productive. And so firms that are able to become more productive, they're also able to expand. And by expanding, they may invest in robots, but there will also always be some human component that an expanding firm needs. And so this indirect productivity effect is working against the substitution effect and may indeed, in the end, promote employment. Now, the debate on this is clearly huge, and there are, as you may expect, there are different sides of the debates in which one side stressing the direct substitution effect as more important than the indirect productivity one, and vice versa. I think an important issue is, once more, coming back to what we discussed earlier, is that when someone loses his or her job due to a robot or due to automation in general, and new jobs are created because of the expansion of the firm thanks to the productivity gains, then there is something that is needed for these workers to find, again, another job in the expanding firm, or for new workers to find a job in the expanding firm, which is, again, they need to have the right skills.
Exactly.
So we are back to the idea that you need a skill upgrade or a skill change or some basic level of education that is needed to work with these machines that are becoming more and more sophisticated. And once more, there is the risk that some of this education will be available only for a subset of the workforce and not for everybody.
Well, Gianmarco, I'd like to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
I'm David Wayne Callahan, and this has been Clarity in a Messy World, a podcast from Bocconi University, Milan. Thanks for listening. You can find references from this episode in the podcast notes. To be notified when new episodes come up, subscribe to Clarity on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker.